companies that are utilizing it to help drive are the ones that are much more transformational and having more success.
Hey, what's up YouTube? Jeremiah Hersey here, and welcome back to another episode of my Know to Pro series. Today we're going to be talking about measures, and when you think of the word measure, you're really trying to define what something is. If you're measuring your couch, you're seeing how long it is. If you're measuring the ceiling for a ceiling fan. Well, in Power BI, measures are ways to calculate specific metrics. And so let's say that we're looking for sales or average profit, things of those nature, anything that you're going to use kind of like a math formula for, that's what a measure is. So a measure is defined as a mathematical calculation. We're going to be using DAX for this. Same principles come into play where we're going to be using single tick marks to call out to our table names and square brackets to call out to our columns. But we're going to be allowed to use different aggregates, and this is going to take up probably a majority of this series. Just making sure that you have an understanding of measures and how they work. They work differently. They work on what's known as filter context. Now, we've talked about row context, where if it's inside of a table, it can only see one row at a time, and the active relationships are deactivated. Well, with measures, that's not the case. Measures use filter context, and so they allow the relationships to be in place, and then from there we can use whatever aggregations we need. So if you want to follow along, the PBIX is down in the description. Go ahead and download that, and let's get started. So here we are in our model, and I just want to make sure that you have your relationships set up. So in the PBIX file that you downloaded, it should have this star schema set up, which we talked about in a different video. So just make sure that you have relationships connected. If you want to go here to manage relationships, you can define them all if they're not defined for some reason, but they should be. And so real quick glance there: city key, customer key, date, employee key, and stock item key. Those are the relationships that were created, and they are one-to-many. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about measures. Before we actually create one here, let's go over to our report view. So measures are really defined in two ways. There are two types of measures. So the two types of measures that we have are known as implicit measures. The other type are known as explicit measures. The main difference between the two is that implicit measures are automatically created, and they use default summarization. Now with explicit measures, these are user defined. So we're going to actually write these measures, and these are also reusable. So we'll talk about how this is going to play a part here in just a second. So the biggest thing to remember: implicit measures automatically created by Power BI, and they use the default summarization. Explicit measures are user defined, and they are reusable. So first things first, let's talk about that default summarization. So any column that has a number in it is going to be automatically applied to default summarization. If you look over here on the right hand side, you'll see this summarization symbol. So any column that has a number in it is going to be automatically summarized. This default summarization is going to apply. This is Power BI's way of helping new users formulate visuals. So these, as we drop them into our visuals, are going to be automatically aggregated in some way. And so an aggregate is like sum, min, max, average. So things of those nature that you're going to be calculating, that is known as an aggregate. And so as one of these columns are chosen, it's going to automatically assign one of these aggregates, typically the sum. But you're going to have the ability to change that. And once again, this is a implicit measure. Power BI is going to automatically create that. And then we'll talk about explicit measures here as well. So let's go ahead and grab a matrix. So the matrix visual is this one right here. It's got the blue backwards L. It's usually next to the table. I just like the matrix because it's a little bit more defined. I like to define the rows and the values within inside of it. So let's look inside of our customer table and let's grab the buying group, and we're going to put that in the rows. Okay, so we're going to put the buying group in the rows section. And then we're going to grab, let's see, from sale, let's grab profit. Notice the default summarization on profit here. Okay, or you can choose a different value if you want to. As we add profit into the values section, what you're going to notice is as we hover over it, it says the sum of the sale table, the profit column. If you click the drop down arrow, you're going to notice all the different options you have to change the summarization. So this is only when you're using implicit measures. Okay, so when you're using measures that Power BI has automatically created, this is how you're going to change them. Okay, so if I wanted the minimum or the average profit, I could just change it right here with this implicit measure. While that's nice, explicit measures can be defined and recalled in other formulas. So let's say that we wanted to find the profit from last year, which we'll do. In that case, we can call out to the profit measure that we're going to create, and we don't have to redefine it as the sum of the profit column as we would if we use explicit measures. So every time that we would need the profit, we would have to write the sum of profit. Well, let's go ahead and do that, and I'll explain that once again. So the thing about measures is that they can live in any table that you want. So they can live in the city table, the customer table, the date table. They can live any table and still work. What I like to do though is I like to create my own measure table. So up here at the top, you'll see the option to enter data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click enter data here, and I'm going to create a measures table. So down here at the bottom, I'm just going to give it the name of measures. But notice over here on the right hand side in the fields section that everything is alphabetical. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a star or a special symbol in front so that way it appears at the top of the list. Okay, so I'm just going to label that measures, and I'm going to hit load. It's just a blank table here. Awesome. So we now have a table that I can store all of my measures in. So I prefer to choose the table that I want to put my measure in. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to choose new measure. You can also go up here to the top and select new measure, and there's also quick measure as well, which is it's a UI that helps you build measures, but I always like to build mine from scratch. This new measure though will drop it in whatever table that it has selected or that it wants to, so I just prefer to right click on the table and choose the new measure option. So I'm going to click new measure here, and we'll see our formula bar appear at the top of the screen. So we're going to be writing the same formula as profit is the sum of that profit column here. All right, so I'm going to call this measure total profit. And I'm just going to use the sum function here. And we're going to use a single tick mark to call it to the sale table and a square bracket to call it to the profit column. There it is. And I'm just hitting tab to autocomplete. And so notice that this is exactly the same as the implicit measure. Take the sum of the profit column. But the benefit here is that we can now define specific properties of this measure. Now, the thing about measures that are different than calculated columns is that you will not see this measure in the data view. So if I go to the data view, notice here, there is nothing in this table. Measure values can only be seen inside of a visual. Okay, this is very, very important. So measures can only be seen inside a visual. So in order to see this total profit measure that we created, we have to drop it inside of this visual. So I'm just going to drop it inside. And notice that we get the same exact results as we expected. But the difference now is that as I go to write other measures, so I'm going to just write a measure here real quick to call it to the profit. And we'll deal with more complicated measures later on, but we're going to talk about the difference here. Okay, so when I go to write a new measure, if I, let's say, start to write this expression, notice here I can use the total profit from the measures table. So the benefit of writing an explicit measure is that as you go to write more complicated measures, you can call out to that measure you've already created. So the total profit is always going to be the sum of the profit column. But now I can write more complicated measures referencing that measure itself. And so that's the benefit of using explicit measures. Now, notice I put a single tick mark here. I wanted to do this to explain that when you see or when you write a measure, you never want to call out to the table that the measure lives in. So remember I said at the beginning, measures can live in any table. So if we call out to the measures table and this measure gets moved into a different table, then this is going to cause it to break. To prevent that from happening, always just call out to the name of the measure using square brackets. Notice I hit a square bracket and that measure pops up. So when you use measures inside of other calculations, you always want to reference just the name of the measure itself and not the table that it's living in. All right. And so I'll just go ahead and kill that formula. We'll talk about one last thing here. I know it's a little bit longer of a video, but this is a lot of information. So the last thing is how measures work using filter context. And so notice here with inside of the visual, we have the buying group. So what happens here is this buying group, which comes from the customer table, is going to filter down the sales table. So the buying group filters down based on the relationship. Okay, so remember our relationship here. So it filters down based on the customer key to the sales table. Then it's going to sum up the profit. So we talked about the difference between these two, right? This total profit, this is an explicit measure. This is one that we define. This is the implicit one. And we'll talk about more about filter context in the next video because this one's getting a little bit longer. But just recognize that these right here are the filters. So this filters down the sales table and then it sums up the values from the profit. Then it filters to Tailspin Toys and does the same thing. The difference in the explicit versus implicit. So notice here I can change the aggregation for the implicit. For the explicit, the one that we defined, you cannot do that. I know it was a lot of information, and I'll make sure to make the next few videos a little bit shorter, so thanks for sticking with me. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.